Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing Show, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful worlds of psychology and mental wellbeing.
So, Dean, from what I understand about perfectionism is it's something that actually applies to all of us in the sense that it's on a scale and on a dimension. And I know before kind of researching into our conversation today, I thought that perfectionism was more confined to just a small corner and percentage of society, but it seems like we all have some level of perfectionism. So can you maybe speak to a little bit about how perfectionism does lie on a scale and how it applies broadly across different contexts like sport, but also work and appearance and how it manifests in our lives?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important myth, I suppose, in some ways, when we think about perfectionism. Certainly in some of the research that I do that's in sport, we think of it only being for those people who are at the very highest level of sport or the very gifted and talented, when actually, as you've just rightly referred to, it's in all of us. And that's something that is really important to understand. And it does extend across a continuum. So we don't just have perfectionists and non-perfectionists. It's rated across a scale or a continuum. So we can have higher levels of perfectionism and lower levels of perfectionism. The reality is most of us sit in kind of middle, and it is true. We do see athletes, for example, having higher levels of certain dimensions of perfectionism. I'll go into those dimensions shortly. It is important to realize that perfectionism does affect all of us. We are all on that continuum, all kind of lower or higher or somewhere in between levels of perfectionism. And it's also worthwhile pointing out that affects different domains of our lives. So it doesn't just affect athletes, for example, in sport. It can affect what we do in education. It can affect what we do at work. And that perfectionism then can be different for those different domains. And again, we can have higher and lower levels of perfectionism depending on that kind of circumstance and context and situation, and of course depending on the individual. So it's what we would refer to as multidimensional, so lots of different dimensions. And I don't know if you can ask that question in a moment of what those dimensions are, so I'll just park that for a moment. We have all of these different dimensions that it can have higher and lower levels of, and importantly it affects different domains of our lives. And of course, with perfectionism and being this kind of personality characteristic, and with other traits that we do have, they can change and vary across the lifespan. And that's similar with perfectionism, and in that it can change from certain periods of our lives, and it's something that does go to a point where it can be more impactful in certain times, in certain situations, than in others.
Yeah, and you mentioned those dimensions a couple of times, Dean. Yeah, so maybe let's go into some of those dimensions and perhaps with some examples of what that might look like, either in someone that you've seen or in the literature, just to color that in if you don't mind.
Yeah, I think it's also maybe worthwhile before going into those dimensions just to kind of define what perfectionism is. And there's a number of different definitions that your readers and listeners will be able to find and access. The one that I like to make reference to is by Frost and colleagues, and this was back in 1990. And this particular definition is really important because it highlights two really key things of perfectionism. So the definition is that it's based on unrealistic high standards of performance and overly critical evaluations of one's behaviour. And those two really important aspects of this definition are unrealistically high. So perfectionistic athletes and people with high levels of perfectionism don't just have high standards for themselves and for other people, they have unrealistically high standards to the point that they are unachievable, unattainable. And then the second part of that definition is overly. So again, perfectionistic athletes and people with high levels of perfectionism don't just have self-critical aspects of their perfectionism that affect themselves or others. They are overly critical, where it is very harsh, very frequent, very intense, and usually it is kind of directed at the self and doesn't account for kind of personal circumstances or situations. So that's how we would define perfectionism. And those two words within that particular definition, unrealistically and overly, I think really kind of nicely characterize just how difficult perfectionism is for people either with perfectionism or people who live or work with people with perfectionism. And one model of perfectionism, and again, your readers and listeners might be aware of the amount of models that are available that you can access and better understand what perfectionism is. One of those models that really has changed the research around perfectionism was based from Hewitt and Flett back in 1991, and they describe perfectionism in 3 different dimensions. So those dimensions are self-oriented perfectionism, so that's demanding perfection from oneself, and that can include that very harsh, frequent self-criticism. We've also got other-oriented perfectionism, so that's where we demand perfection from other people, and this is where we can be very critical of other people's achievements. And then the final 3rd dimension is socially prescribed perfectionism, and that's the belief that other people demand perfection from oneself. And this is where we can believe that other people are critical of our achievements, critical of what we're doing, our standards, etc. So they're the 3 dimensions. And bringing it back to our first question at the start, in terms of the continuum that we see perfectionism on, we can have athletes and we can have people more broadly, I suppose, having high levels of self-oriented perfectionism and lower levels of other-oriented perfectionism and socially prescribed perfectionism. And we can have other people having higher levels of socially prescribed perfectionism, but lower levels of other-oriented perfectionism and self-oriented perfectionism. And that can then change depending on the domain that we see that in. So I think we're already seeing how not only complex perfectionism is and how kind of deep in regards to like our understanding of it is, but we can also see the dimensions that we have, the levels that we can see, but also the domains that it manifests in. And so trying to understand those 3 different facets is really important before we kind of see how it impacts the way that we live and the way that we play if it's in regards to sports.
So with those 3 dimensions that you said, self-oriented, other-oriented, and socially prescribed, do we see different outcomes and consequences, either in sports or broadly on well-being, if you're higher or lower on those different dimensions of perfection?
Yeah, so we will often see athletes with higher levels of self-oriented perfectionism striving for their goals, a constant demand of themselves to excel and to achieve the goals that they're setting themselves. So some of the research that we have that's related to self-oriented perfectionism has elements of adaptiveness to it, and that can facilitate performance, and that can be something that's worthwhile for well-being. Other-oriented perfectionism and socially prescribed perfectionism is slightly in the reverse towards that. Certainly socially prescribed perfectionism is, so it's that belief that other people demanding perfectionism from yourself. That encompasses a lot of evaluative concerns, a lot of maladaptive, really crippling aspects for athletes' performance. They're continually thinking of what others are judging and others are evaluating in regards to how they're performing. And obviously that brings with it a whole host of performance-related problems, but it also brings with it, and probably more importantly, a number of well-being ones. When it comes to the research around other-oriented perfectionism inside of sport, we've got a lot less to look at. Outside of sport, we can see that it has also a number of crippling outcomes for people who live with someone such as a coach or a teacher who have got higher levels of other-oriented perfectionism. So we would think that it's difficult to live with someone who's got self-oriented perfectionism, but it's even harder to live with someone who's got other-oriented perfectionism. You're constantly demanding perfection from other people. You're constantly setting those standards so high that they are unrealistic, and you are constantly criticizing what other people are doing and the other people's achievements. And for those other people, that is really difficult. And inside of sport, we've got one particular study from our group at York St John University that have started to look at other-oriented perfectionism and already seeing some difficult outcomes because of it. So we see that coaches who have got higher levels of other-oriented perfectionism, so demanding perfection from their athletes, we can see then that athletes predict higher levels of burnout within those athletes. So that compulsive, obsessive, continual nature of other-oriented perfectionism can be really difficult for athletes in particular, but outside of sport, it can also be a really tough thing to have to cope with and live with who have levels of other-oriented perfection.
So when you say burnout, Dean, so just to clarify, so we're talking about if I, as a coach, have really high expectations of others and high perfectionistic perfections of others that leads to burnout in others. Is that
Yeah.
what you see in the research?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that study was by Luke Ollison and colleagues. And you're absolutely right. Yeah. So coaches who have got these higher levels of other-oriented perfection, and as you said, are setting standards to an unrealistic point where they are never going to be achieved. If they are continually being critical of the athlete's achievements, then we will then see higher levels of burnout in those athletes, which is something that we can probably, I guess, agree on or just presume, I guess, without needing that research, I suppose, in some ways. Like if we were to think about a coach who is just continually providing support that maybe isn't transpired or seen as support from and they are obsessing over absolutely everything, isn't in a position to highlight positives, isn't giving unconditional regards. When we see these types of behaviors, these types of cognition, then athletes are going to really struggle with that. And that's where we will see things like burnout become more apparent in athletes.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you see this a lot more than I do as a sports psychologist, but my impression is that in high performance environments, there's this real pursuit of excellence. And I imagine that, and that's driven by coaches. And I imagine that it's a hard balance to find between excellence and perfectionism. I think I was watching, I'm a big Manchester United fan, which I think from my Twitter stalk, you might be as well.
Yeah.
That there was a video titled "Too Many Mistakes" from Eric Ten Hag, and was essentially criticizing the playing group of making too many mistakes during a drill. So I use that as an example, but how do coaches then find a balance between excellence and perfectionism?
Definitely, yeah. I think it's a really tough one for coaches to get right, and there's a really fine line between that pursuit of excellence where there's are extremely high and things like regard for athletes' successes in training and in competitions is pushed towards support rather than just continual challenge. And we talk about the term high challenge and high support, and that's one thing that coaches can get right. So pushing standards high enough that they're not pushing into unrealistic standards is one thing that coaches need to get right, and that's one thing that is certainly a challenge that they'll have to cope with. But applying those standards with an equal amount of support is something that at least will help athletes manage those standards. But it's certainly a real kind of, as I say, challenge for coaches to get right. And I think, as I said at the start, like part of my research really was to try and help sports psychologists, but also coaches really when it comes to, okay, so this is an athlete who's got high levels of perfectionism. How do we support them? And also the other side of that, this is a coach who's got real high levels of perfectionism. How do we support them? And that research isn't available at the moment. So I suppose in some ways coaches haven't got the resources to better understand what it is that they should be doing. But there's certainly things that they can do and to seek out resources such as this particular podcast to better understand the things that maybe they should begin to do that maybe isn't necessarily in the research or isn't underpinned by evidence at the moment. But one of those things would be to provide as much support to athletes as they are with their amount of challenge. And by challenge, I mean the amount of high standards and criticism that they are giving to their athletes. And most coaches will probably say that they need to have those standards, need to criticize or provide feedback that they push towards, okay, so how to do this better. And most coaches will probably echo that, but it's about then providing support. And second to that might be just the way that they communicate and work with athletes. So we can have those high standards and we can have feedback that is aimed at developing on those mistakes. But we can also have communication. So it's about trying to highlight things that have gone well. So there's almost a reflective, evaluative plan when working with athletes. So it isn't just solely based on focusing on things that aren't going so well in order to make them better. It's about also highlighting the things that the athletes are doing well at. So working together, reflecting and evaluating so that kind of plan going forward has as much good things coming out of it as well as bad things. And so an action plan grows out of that. And that's something that's really important. So working with perfectionistic coaches will lack a lot of those skills and will solely focus on the things that need to be made better, because with perfectionistic coaches, because they've got these unrealistic high standards, whatever the athlete does, even if it is 10 perfect passes, that still isn't good enough for that coach. So there's a little bit of those activities. There's maybe a little bit of self-awareness and self-reflection that coaches might need to engage in. So that might involve writing tasks at the end of a coaching session. It might involve some video analysis of themselves coaching and working with a sports psychologist or working with someone outside of the organization to better understand some of their own behaviors, some of their own ways of coaching to align to a more facilitative, kind of healthy way of coaching. So I think there's a number of things that coaches can do, but hopefully in the next year or two, there'll be more research that will hopefully provide more instruction towards coaches and towards sports psychologists to better educate them going forward.
So on that point then, Dean, of becoming aware of, or coaches becoming aware of their perfectionistic kind of behaviors and other oriented behaviors and demands of their athletes, what are some of the signs that either coaches or athletes themselves should be looking out for, which perhaps indicate a higher level of particularly self-oriented perfectionism?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I've touched on kind of the idea of self-awareness. And I think that's a really important thing. And we'll often see coaches and athletes and people with high levels of perfectionism not wanting to be self-aware, not wanting to either potentially seek help for their perfectionism or to better understand how they can reduce certain aspects of that for a number of different reasons. One of those is not wanting to be deemed weak. There's certainly a level of stigma around seeking help, certainly for sports psychology support, but also for things like mental health support. But being better aware of themselves is certainly one thing that coaches need to be. And so with that awareness doesn't necessarily come a reduction in things like perfectionism, but it at least shows a level of engagement and willingness to become a better coach. And I think for most coaches, I certainly would hope for all coaches, but I think for most coaches, there is a level of, I want to get better. What kind of things can I do? So hopefully we will see coaches, as I say, come and listen to things like this particular podcast to better understand and to enhance their skills. Other things include this idea of unconditional regard. So they shouldn't want athletes to perform or train to a level where they can only get positive feedback or have, conditional regard. So they shouldn't have to do certain conditions to get positive feedback. It should be unconditional. And so I suppose coaches might need to identify what kind of things are they saying and what kind of actions are they doing that identifies with this idea of unconditional regard. And so that might be one important step. The level of communication that they engage with. So if athletes, for example, make mistakes in the training environment and coaches don't engage with that particular athlete after making a mistake, that can be perceived as perfectionistic. They're not wanting to engage with that athlete because they've not got to the standards that the coach is asking for. So there might be some need for coaches to have a better array of skills when it comes to athletes who do indeed make mistakes. It might be that athletes are allowed to make mistakes, and so therefore coaches might need to better portray what that looks like. And for some coaches, it might be making mistakes themselves, and to better show that actually mistakes are good. Failure is part of sport, and so therefore we shouldn't be trying to move away from either making mistakes or we shouldn't be concerned with what others indeed think if we do indeed make an error on the training pitch or in a big competition. It should be part of life, and it should be part of the coaching that has been put on for athletes.
One of the things I'm getting a lot just throughout this whole conversation, Dean, is that it sounds like what you're saying is a supportive environment and climate in a sporting organization is quite important. Those higher end perfectionistic or higher on perfectionism as a trait. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. High levels of challenge, but also high levels of support or equal levels of support. And that support might directly come from the coach, but also might come from other people in that organization and environment, like sports psychologists, about trying to align with everyone's value rather than just what the coach's ideas of of standards and performance look like? And I think that's a really important thing that organizations should be trying to look at doing is increasing the amount of people who are part of that journey. It's not just about, or it shouldn't be about the coach and what they're doing. And one way of making their job would be to increase the amount of people who are there to support athletes, as well as them, the coaches, seeking out more awareness, seeking out better ways of indeed coaching to kind of also increase their level of support that they engage with for their athletes.
And Dean, we've talked a lot about a lot of perfectionism in a maladaptive sense, and perhaps the dangers of it from a well-being and from a performance perspective. Is perfectionism functional? I think you mentioned earlier about, and correct me if I'm wrong, perhaps the perfectionistic strivings are less maladaptive than perfectionistic concerns. Is that right? Or
yeah, what I didn't do actually earlier was kind of conceptualize it into two higher order dimensions. So when we look into the research, we often see two dimensions that are referred to, and you've just touched upon one of those, which is perfectionistic strivings. So that's where we essentially, because in perfectionism, there's so many different models, so many different ways of measuring perfectionism, we want to bring a number of those models and a number of those measures together to create these higher order dimensions. So perfectionistic strivings is made up of striving for perfectionism. It's made up of self-oriented perfectionism, which was one of the dimensions from Hewitt and Flett's models. And it's also made up of personal standards. So in the research, when it comes to perfectionistic strivings, we have a whole host of different outcomes, some of which can be positive for performance. Some include things like increased motivation. We can have a level of focus. We often see a lot of very diligent behaviors, extremely committed, I guess, to the goals that they are setting themselves and that they are setting other people. Very meticulous with everything that they try and do. But it also comes with a number of maladaptive outcomes for both performance and well-being. So we see it related to things like being insecure and dissatisfied with the goals that they've set themselves. Also remembering that perfectionism is about unrealistic high standards. So these goals are never really achieved. And so that includes athletes with high levels of perfectionistic strivings. And with that, there's a level of kind of compulsiveness, obsessiveness, continually pushing themselves. And obviously that brings with it a whole host of different problems, including a level of self-criticism and a level of kind of self-defeating, not being good enough. But there is some aspects of perfectionistic strivings that is beneficial for both performance and well-being. But importantly, there's also a number of outcomes that are really bad for performance and wellness and well-being. And so a really important review that the listeners will be able to find by Andy Hill and colleagues in 2018 reviewed over 50-odd studies in perfectionism. And one of their conclusions from that was that perfectionistic striving was just really complex and ambiguous and not really clear enough to suggest that we should be pushing perfectionistic strivings in athletes and in environments. The other higher order dimension, which I've not touched upon, is called perfectionistic concerns. So that's made up of concerns of mistakes, negative reactions to imperfection, and socially prescribed perfectionism. And that is, in the research, always related to problematic outcomes for both performance and well-being. So it's always related to things like high levels of anxiety, depression, and even things like suicidal thoughts. And that was also echoed in this particular meta-analysis by Andy Hill, which, for you listeners, if they haven't already read that particular review, it will be one that I would encourage those listeners to go and engage with. So those are our kind of two higher order dimensions. So it's a lot easier for us to kind of describe and understand perfectionism from those two higher order dimensions. It gives us a really broad understanding of perfectionism in sport or in a different, but we can still use the three dimensions from Hewitt and Flett, and in the research, and that is still used as a way of understanding perfectionism. Some of my own research, though, has just used these higher order dimensions, and part of the reason really was to get a very broad, in-depth understanding of perfectionism from the athlete's perspective. And so hopefully that's kind of answered your question and showing a bit more light on perfectionism and specifically perfectionistic strivings and perfectionistic concerns and what kind of some of the outcomes might be from two of those dimensions.
That certainly has answered my question. And yeah, I'll link it was a 2018 Hill meta-analysis, was it?
Yes.
The article you're referring to. Yeah, I'll link that in the notes so people can check that one. And you mentioned, Dean, perfectionistic concerns being linked with a number of adverse outcomes. Do you have much knowledge over what some of the root causes are in particular of the people who are kind of higher in perfectionistic concerns? Is that something in athletes that is kind of socialized when they get to an elite sport environment, or is that something that happens at a much earlier age through bringing or familial kind of influences?
Yeah, I think one of the many debates that we have in perfectionism is that one of, is it something that's inherited or is it something that is learned? And it's the same for perfectionism. So there is an ongoing debate in regard to that particular question. Is it something that is passed on through our parents' genes? Is it ingrained and embedded in the way we are? Or is it indeed something that you've put through in your question, or something that's learned? Is it malleable, that changes over time? And my particular feeling on this is something that is almost 50-50, which is obviously sitting on the fence somewhat, but something that is passed through in regards to the kind of the hereditary nature. It's passed through our genes from our parents, and we have certain characteristics that are passed on, and these particular characteristics can be either fueled or facilitated in environments that we find ourselves in. And obviously early on, that's very much based on interactions with our parents, interactions with siblings, and obviously that then becomes a little wider the older we get. So obviously we start school, and that social learning then extends to school friends, to teachers, and it gets wider still as we then maybe attend things like different sports that have different coaches who we then interact with, and those environments become even more diverse. And so that's how I feel perfectionism grows and changes. And something that I talked earlier was our personality characteristics and traits do change over time. Some are more fixed. So we think about the big five, for example, is far more fixed than what perfectionism is. But with perfectionism, we're likely to see it in fact change and become very malleable in these different contexts and situations that we do find ourselves in. And parents are certainly, because they're the first people that we really do interact with, they're really the main ones that either start off some of those aspects of perfectionism that can be important for performance, but they can also be the ones that start off some of those aspects that maybe aren't so good. And given the people that we find ourselves working with and being around over the course of our lives, that level of perfectionism and those aspects of perfectionism also change. So there's some research that's looked at this idea of social learning as well as parents. But as I say, I think there's definitely some shared overlap within that. There's also a really interesting line of research from York St John University, looking at perfectionistic climates. So the idea of coaches and how they actually create environments that are underpinned by perfectionism. And so there's some really interesting findings from that, and something that we've touched on already in terms of what coaches and organizations can do better to either reduce what it is that they're doing to also reduce that level of perfectionism that's being emitted from some of those behaviors.
Oh, awesome, Dean. Yeah, there's a lot there throughout what we've spoken about today that I think people are going to benefit a lot from. And look, I'm conscious of time. Just want to ask a couple more questions if you're okay with that.
Absolutely.
So I know you've touched on this and you've given a lot of guidance as to what people can do if they do identify as being higher in perfectionism, but I just want to maybe encapsulate that. So if I'm someone listening to this right now and a lot of the things that you're saying is resonating with me in terms of the perfectionistic strivings and concerns and some of those behaviors, where should I start in terms of, I've identified that, yep, that does sound like me and that is something I want to change. Where would you advise someone to start?
Yeah, I mean, again, really good question. Frustratingly, moment in time, there is little research around what athletes can do when it comes to reducing perfectionism. But the research that is in place has looked at things like compassion, mindfulness, and self-help books. So there would be the things that I would then suggest for athletes and for indeed people that aren't involved in sports to engage with. A lot of the research outside of sport has looked at various cognitive behavior therapies to reduce perfectionism. So if indeed you feel like your perfectionism is hindering things that you do and you're struggling to cope with it, finding a healthcare professional or a psychologist who is in a position and registered to competently support you, that would be one of the first things that I would probably suggest you go and do. For athletes who are wanting or don't feel like they need to go and see a therapist or a psychologist just at this present moment in time, it might be something that certain moments can be really difficult to live with, but generally it's something that you can manage, which as I said near at the start of the conversation, we sit somewhere in the middle, but it also changes. We see that certain aspects of perfectionism increase and decrease over our life, depending on situations that we find ourselves in. So things might get better, things might get worse when it comes to your own perfectionism. So trying to find resources, so doing things like compassion-based diaries have been shown to reduce aspects of perfectionism, and this idea of increasing our compassion towards ourselves makes a lot of sense, right? When it comes to perfectionism, we know perfectionists are self-defeating, critical on themselves, you're never satisfied. So I guess compassion and compassion-focused therapy has a really important place when it comes to reducing perfectionism. But there's only been one study inside of sport thus far, and that was by Amber Moswich in 2013. And that's one thing that you can start to do. So seeking out things that are related to self-compassion, increasing self-compassion. The other thing would be mindfulness. There's a couple of studies inside of sport that have used mindfulness-based interventions. So, engaging in breathing exercises, trying to kind of center our experiences when it comes to perfectionism, so we're not engaging in perfectionistic behaviors as often in certain situations. And then the last piece of research that's just published in 2020 by Andy Hill and Tracy Donachie looked at using self-help books that are underpinned by cognitive behavior therapy. And those self-help books are available that you can very easily, and it takes you through a number of cognitive behavior components aimed at reducing aspects of perfectionism, and they've been shown to be effective for certain aspects of perfectionism, but also for perfectionistic cognitions, which is kind of the frequency of thoughts that we have that are underpinned by perfectionism. So there's a number of things that certainly athletes can engage with. There's a number of things that I guess the general audience that maybe aren't involved in sport can engage with. One difficulty that we've not necessarily touched on as part of this interview is the idea of kind of help seeking. Having resources available is one thing, but we know that perfectionistic athletes certainly aren't always open and engaged in seeking help for either performance-related needs or indeed for their well-being. So we often see that with higher levels of perfectionistic concern, so far more stigma, a lot less open to indeed receiving either of those forms of support, a lot less confidence that in fact that the support that's on offer is even going to support them in the right way. So having the support available, as I say, is one good thing. We also need to be aware that increasing our level of attitude towards help is also an important first step, I think, before actually providing things like the interventions and the support that I highlighted a minute ago. So there's a number of things that sports psychologists and coaches can try and do to increase that level of engagement and decrease things like stigma and various other preconceptions that athletes might have towards sports psychology and mental health support. So trying to increase better relationships, increase things like rapport at the start of interventions or at the start of a new working relationship are really important. We've also thought about delivering online interventions. So sports psychologists who are listening, we know that delivering online resources can increase the receptibility of sports psychology interventions as well as decrease the various forms of stigma that athletes are likely to have towards the interventions that you're hoping to deliver. So there's a number of important things to consider for athletes, but also for those that are supporting athletes when it comes to their own perfectionism and their help-seeking behaviours that they have towards the support that's in place.
And on that, you mentioned, Dean, stigma and those perhaps who are less inclined to seek mental health support in the sport environment. I'm wondering, do you have any perhaps examples of how you walked into an environment, either in your past or current work as a sports psych, where that there has been a large amount of stigma and you've perhaps been able to overcome that and to create a culture either in an organization or one-on-one with someone where they've been more open to seeking help?
Mm-hmm. There's not been many environments where I've gone in or have started where there isn't a good number of athletes that don't really want to talk to you or don't want to be seen with the psychologist out of fear of what that looks like to the rest of the team. And obviously this, in fact, relate more to a team than an individual. When I've supported individuals in the past, it's usually themselves or their coaches that have wanted them to receive some support. So overcoming those particular feelings of I don't want to be here and other aspects of stigma is a lot easier than what it is working with a team where you've got 15, 20 athletes and a good number of coaches that do have those feelings and do have those thoughts. But something that I've tried to work on and from a paper that I've had published that have looked at perfectionism and help-seeking attitudes, which was published at the end of last year, something that I've tried to work on within my own practice is increase the level of education. And it might sound something that's an easy thing to do, but I know that the psychologists don't have a prolonged period of education, especially when it comes to working in organizations. I think there's an idea that there needs to be quick wins and there needs to be interventions and things delivered to increase performance almost immediately. We want to see those benefits as soon as they've started, almost in some areas of sports. But trying to increase education around what sports psychology is, how it can help athletes, what are the different elements that might be touched on in terms of workshops, in terms of one-to-ones. So it really does prepare the athlete. And definitely from my own experiences, it's something that I've not done well enough, even though it's something that I've said I would do, a workshop or two on education. It still doesn't provide enough information to them, and it still doesn't provide them with a better position to then change some of their attitudes. So I've done a couple of intervention studies. One that's hoping, or that should be published at some point in the autumn or winter of this year, or the end of this year, I should say, maybe. That's actually focused on a prolonged or a period of time that is about engaging and is about increasing those attitudes. And so hopefully that'll provide sports psychologists with a bit more of an idea about what they can potentially do. But certainly from my own experiences, trying to increase that education and almost not engaging in anything else other than education, even in those kind of smaller conversations with athletes on a more of a one-to-one basis. It's still about this is what sports psychology is, really kind of uncovering the questions that they might have and are likely to have when it comes to psychology. And certainly in the UK, despite it growing and has been growing for over 20 years, there's still a number of organisations that haven't had a psychologist, and those organisations would classified as high performance sports. And so a lot of athletes that are involved in those environments haven't been seen by a psychologist or haven't had any interaction with one. So that and because of that also builds a level of stigma. Why haven't we had a psychologist? And it does kind of build that narrative that psychology is just for people who are really struggling with mental health and who are depressed and who can only once they've tried everything else see a psychologist. And that narrative still exists, and despite it changing more recently, it's still something that we as psychologists have to try and work with. So as I say, working with it around kind of education and building that to a really kind of robust level, I think is one way of helping those athletes overcome things like stigma and various other problematic attitudes.
It seems like, sports psychology is still such a growing and an emerging field, which makes the research you and your colleagues are doing even more, I think, exciting and impactful as well on the field.
Mm.
Do you have any kind of final words of guidance for anyone listening, or anything else that you feel like you really want to share, Dean?
There's a couple of studies. I don't know whether you want to put these in an earlier part of the conversation, and it maybe should have been something that I just mentioned then in terms of attitudes, but a couple of really important studies. Firstly by Witcher and colleagues in 2015, which was a qualitative study, interviewed perfectionistic athletes. And one really interesting point from that particular piece of research was that actually that perfectionistic athletes value their own perfectionism. And because of that, working with perfectionistic athletes from a psychology perspective can be really challenging. You've not only got these problematic attitudes, but you've got an idea that perfectionistic athletes need their perfectionism to perform to a certain level. And with that also comes a level of education. They don't necessarily know what the other side looks like in terms of a reduced level of perfectionistic concerns. For example, they feel like if we're reducing perfectionism, it means reducing their standards and their performances, and for them that's a bad thing. So that's a really interesting study. And then one that's just in press by Cloquer and colleagues, also a qualitative study, this time interviewing sports psychology practitioners and their experience of working with perfectionistic athletes, and highlighted really a lot of the challenges that they are faced with when working with perfectionistic athletes, and their own knowledge and their own ideas around perfectionism were really important. So that again highlights the need for sports psychologists this time to better educate themselves on perfectionism, being better self-aware of what's available to them. So again, listening to things like this particular podcast to instruct themselves when it comes to working with perfectionistic athletes. But a couple of really important studies that really demonstrate perfectionism is just really complex, and working with athletes one-to-one, or working with a group of perfectionistic athletes, or working with a coach who's got high levels of perfectionism is really challenging. And so it does need to come with a level of qualification and a level of competency. And so hopefully with that will come that continual, I guess, CPD to help develop their knowledge when it comes to working with perfectionism. And so that I just wanted to mention those.
Awesome, Dean. I'll definitely link those in the notes for people to have a look at. And in the way of further research, if people wanted to have a look at your research, I know you said you've got a paper coming out, and I think at York St John you guys are pretty energetic in your publishing on this particular area. Is there any way that they can perhaps follow or stay tuned to for when this research does come out, or to look for themselves?
Yeah, we've got a repository at York St John University, which is coming out monthly when it comes to sport. Professor Andrew Hill, who directs the research group at the university, is someone who leads this internationally. So looking for papers with his particular name on would certainly put you in a strong position to better understand it. I've just got the one paper that was published last year, which was the attitudes paper. So I can put a link for that particular study, and then hopefully another one which is more intervention based, which will hopefully be even more interesting, certainly for psychologists and coaches to better understand what it is that they can try and do and deliver to help perfectionistic athletes cope. And so that particular study was actually a psychological skills training intervention that I delivered to a group of athletes to better understand kind of how effective it was, and on the nature of the two studies that I've highlighted a moment ago in terms of it being really challenging and complex. This particular study also demonstrates that in that psychological skills training doesn't actually reduce perfectionistic cognitions, which is an aspect of perfectionism, as effectively as what we would hope. So it really does, again, demonstrate that, but also lead us to need to use other more effective, robust cognitive behavior therapies to reduce perfectionism inside of sport, especially. So there's a repository which I can provide you with the link to, as well as my current paper and paper that hopefully will be available in the next few months.
Awesome, Dean. Sounds exciting time.